Once you decide to hire a landscape architect and reach out to them, typically there'll be some type of client intake. So that could be a phone call, a video meeting, or a actual written form that you fill out that has information about your project, like what's your budget, what's your timeline, things like that, to help clarify so that the landscape architect can decide if this project would be a good fit. After that initial intake, the landscape architect will typically come out to your site or send someone from their office to look at the site conditions, to talk with you more about the project so that they can create a written proposal. This proposal outlines the services that you will be receiving from the landscape architect. So this is usually between the landscape architect or the company and you, the homeowner. A proposal from a landscape architect will usually include a few basics. Here are some things that I include in my contracts with homeowners. The general scope of work. This is where the landscape architect includes their understanding of your wishes for the project. So this could be certain design elements you wish to be included, the area of work, other items like that that help define what this work is going to include. In my proposals, I also include the project area and the general scope of work. This is where I'll list the site address and the estimated square footage of the area of work. Scope of services. This details the design services that are included in the proposal. Typically, there are 4 separate design phases that can be included in a proposal: schematic design, design development, construction documentation, and construction observation. The schematic phase usually illustrates the principal components and materials of the design. Generally, you'll get a few options. I usually include 2 to 3 different design options that have completely different layouts, different material suggestions. And at the end of this phase, those 2 to 3 options will be narrowed down into one final schematic option. The design development phase takes the approved plan from the schematic design phase and develops that in further detail. Typically, at the end of this phase, you should have a set of drawings that could be looked at by a contractor to give a preliminary price. The construction documentation phase takes the approved design development plans and budget and pushes those further, providing even more detail. Typically, at the end of this phase, the set of drawings is used by the contractor to build the project. The construction observation phase details the landscape architect's anticipated role once the project is in construction. This could include things like selecting plants at the nursery, tagging trees, laying out the plants before they're installed, and also a lot of problem solving that comes up during the construction process. So being available to help with any redesign that's needed because of site conditions, or reviewing requests for information from the contractor, corresponding with the contractor, and ensuring that they're sticking to timelines and deadlines, and really just being a representative for the homeowner. Schedule. There's usually an item in a landscape architect's proposal that will include the timeline or schedule for the design work to be completed. Compensation. This section details the fees that will be due for each phase of work. Fees can be lump sum, which is a fixed amount of money, which won't change unless the outline scope of work changes. Alternatively, you could have a time and materials contract, which means you pay for the exact amount of hours worked. Some landscape architect proposals will include both of these fee structures, lump sum and time and materials. For mine, I usually do a lump sum for the first 3 phases, and then for construction observation, do time and materials. The proposal should also outline when the billing will take place. Typically, this is usually on a monthly basis or upon phase completion or deliverable delivery. Say that 5 times fast. Another item in the compensation section will be the cost of a retainer otherwise known as a deposit, for the design work to begin. Sometimes this can be a percentage of the overall work, or this is just a set number that the landscape architect has determined is sufficient so that they can proceed with the work. And finally, there may be a section that lists additional services and out-of-scope items. Additional services might include things like extra meetings needed that go beyond what was outlined in the original agreement, or preparation of permit or as-built drawings. Out-of-scope items could include things like horticultural soil testing, or arborist reports, or fees needed for a permit submittal to the city or government agency. Once the landscape architectural proposal is signed and the deposit is paid, then their work can begin. The very first thing that happens before everything else is that a base map needs to be created. Usually on small urban projects, the landscape architect and their team can do this themselves. But on larger projects or projects that have significant slope or where precise delineations are needed, like property lines or utilities, this is done by a surveyor. A licensed surveyor will come to the site and take those measurements and provide a CAD drawing to the landscape architect to use as a base. Once the base information for the existing conditions is received, then the schematic design phase can begin. This is where the landscape architect will take all of your hopes and wishes and needs for the site, as well as using their own experience and expertise, and create different design alternatives for you to choose from. A lot of times at this phase, the plans will be in color rendered form. You may have some sketches of elevations and sections that show more basic information. We're not looking at specifics yet at this phase. We are looking more at the overall layout and the geometries and themes of the design alternatives. Materials, specific plant selection, more details will come in the next phase. The landscape architect will meet with you to discuss these different design alternatives. Thanks, Reggie. So you can go over them together. At Folly, we also like to include precedent imagery, also known as a mood board, and cost estimates, as well as some plant material suggestions, just to get you thinking about what you like and to get some of your initial feedback. After this first schematic design meeting, you'll have some time to consider which design alternative you want to proceed with. Most of the times, this is a culmination or a consolidation between multiple design options. I would say it's very rare that I've had one design option that is picked to proceed with. Usually it'll be a bit from option one, a bit from option two that can be resolved together in a final schematic option. Once the final schematic design, that consolidation of those different design alternatives is approved by you, then the project can move forward into the design development phase. This is where the design is developed in detail. Materials are selected, finishes are selected, the style is refined, layout and planting material is refined further. At the end of this phase, the document that is generated will be given to the contractor, usually for preliminary pricing. During this phase, there's typically a lot of back and forth with the landscape architect to refine the materials and finishes. So this might include them bringing product samples to your house. So for example, a big piece of paving that they can bring and see what it looks like on site, or gravel or pebbles or different colors that they want to incorporate into the design to make sure that they look good on the property and so that you can see them in person to select them. Once the set of drawings is completed, you would have another meeting with the landscape architect to review every page of this document. Any revisions that you have would be incorporated into a final set of design development drawings. Oftentimes at the end of the design development phase, these drawings are sent out to landscape contractors for preliminary cost estimates. This is so we can put numbers from real landscape contractors who are a good fit for the project to the drawings to see what the overall cost is going to be. Up until now, the cost estimates have been coming from the landscape architect. And although we do use our knowledge and current data as best as we can to provide cost estimates, it's still not as accurate as going directly to that landscape contractor so that they can provide those numbers of what it would take to build the project. Once the preliminary cost estimates are received back from the landscape contractors, there is time to go over these numbers and decide how to proceed with a project. Ideally, any material changes or finishing changes or layout changes are resolved by the end of the design development phase, so that when we move into construction documentation, the area of work and scope has already been clearly defined. When the design project moves in construction documentation, this is where everything is specified. So additional details are developed, product specifications are created. This is the phase where everything is really tightened up to a very exacting detail so that the drawings that are created from this can be used by the contractor to actually build the project. And although there is some back and forth between the homeowner and landscape architect during the construction documentation phase, because the materials and finishes and layout and most elements have been selected up until this point, it's really more an opportunity for the landscape architect to tighten up the drawing set to provide a really robust set of drawings for a landscape contractor to build from. Usually at the end of this phase, before the drawings go out again to landscape contractors for bidding or a final cost estimate, there's a page turn meeting. So this can be quite long and is where every page of that construction document is turned and reviewed by the team. And if a landscape contractor has already been selected, as can be done in the design development phase once that preliminary cost estimate has been returned, it's great to have them in this final page turn so they can review the drawing set and see if there's any missing information and give the landscape architect one more chance to finalize these drawings before construction begins. Once the construction documentation phase is completed, the project enters the bid phase. Now, this is not a design phase, so this may be included in your landscape architect's proposal under the construction documentation, or they may have an item or an hourly rate to provide some oversight during the bid phase. The reason for their involvement during the bid phase will be if the contractor has any questions, there is time and some back and forth between the two of them to answer those questions and to refine the scope of work, anything that comes up that can influence the cost estimate that the contractor is providing. Once bids or cost estimates are back from the landscape contractor, there is a difference between these two, but we won't be covering that quite yet. Once those are received from the landscape contractor, we can review those numbers with the homeowner and decide which landscape contractor to choose. Your landscape architect should be available at the end of this bid phase to review these numbers with you and to give you any recommendations. A lot of the times we've worked with these landscape contractors, we may have worked with all three of them, and the numbers that come back may be very similar. So we have some thoughts based on our experience and working with them of who could be the best fit for your project. Once the landscape contractor is selected and awarded the project, then we can move into construction. Once the construction work begins, the landscape architect will enter into the construction observation phase with you. During construction, the landscape architect or their team members can be available to come out to the site to observe some of the work that is happening. A lot of times there are key moments where we want to be included to oversee the work or approve things that are happening during installation. In addition to this, there are a lot of questions that come up during construction that weren't anticipated in the contract documents or plans. These can be questions by the contractor that need to be either resolved with a additional design, or these can be resolved on site in conversation between the two. If you're relying on your landscape architect to provide construction observation, it can alleviate some of the pressure off of the homeowner to be super involved at this phase. That said, it's still great for you to be in contact with the landscape architect because they don't live there. They're not there 24 hours a day. They usually are there maybe once a week during the construction phase. So you're needed to tell them anything that seems out of the ordinary that's going on, or if you have any questions that they can help clarify. Once construction is done, typically your contract with the landscape architect is completed. We typically won't just throw you to the wolves after construction is over, and can be available for some of the things that are needed post-construction, like making recommendations for maintenance people or other professionals that will help keep your project looking amazing. You might be saying, yes, Rachel, this is so great, but how much does a landscape architect cost? Of course, every project is different, but generally anywhere between 10 to 20% of the construction costs of your project is what a landscape architect's fee will be. Just remember that if you have any questions for your landscape architect once you get their proposal back, we're happy to discuss our design fee numbers with you and come to a place that works well for everybody. And if not, we're happy to recommend other professionals that you can work with that maybe are a better fit. Up next, what's the difference between a landscape architect and a landscape designer?